Good evening, Asia. Good afternoon, Europe and Africa. And good morning to the Americas. Welcome to the Connecting the Dots, a laser-focused quick-fire interview on food and agriculture with international experts where we seek answers to questions all of us should be asking. I'm Ajay Jakhar, Chairman Bharat Krishik Samaj of Farmers Forum India, as well as the Vice Chair of Action Track 2, Shift to Sustainable Consumption Patterns at the United Nations Food Systems Summit. Over the past decade, the number of people in the world suffering from undernutrition has increased. Ironically, most of those suffering from chronic hunger are farmers, while most of those who are obese are consumers who buy the food. Farmers too are increasingly becoming dependent for their food, which is either highly processed or coming from distant places. And due to exploitative food systems, the rural communities are often compelled to migrate in search of better livelihoods. Today, we seek key insights on food systems from Professor Tim Benton, who is the Energy, Environment and Resources Program at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. Tim, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Hello, AJ. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. You have recently published a fascinating research document titled Food Systems Impacts on Biodiversity Loss, in which you have identified the global food systems as the primary driver of accelerating biodiversity loss around the world. A key problem the report identifies is the food systems have been shaped over the past decades by cheaper food paradigms, which is degrading the environment and slowly killing the planet. Can you please elaborate on your key findings?
Yes, very happy to, AJ. I think the main point of the notion of the cheaper food paradigm is that we have spent the last 50 years on a global basis thinking that decreasing the price of food is always a good thing from a public goods perspective. And we have put in place a whole raft of policy instruments around incentivizing more intensive agriculture and liberalizing global trade that act as themselves as incentives to further intensify agriculture and produce more and more and more. And this notion that food should become ever cheaper from a globally competitive market has just led to a whole lot of negative outcomes. So food is now so cheap in terms of calorie production on a global basis that many people can afford to waste it. Many people can afford to overeat it. So we have obesity and the related diseases as a crisis. Given the global market, those countries that can produce and export can make a lot of money from doing it. So that allows countries that are interested in getting environmental subsidies and degrading the environment and stripping out biodiversity or mining soils to make a profit. The fact that grain is now so cheap means that we can feed it to livestock, so more and more people are eating meat, with climate change and biodiversity implications that come from that. The overall drive to produce ever more food is degrading the environment, it's polluting the atmosphere, driving climate change, changing our land use patterns, impacting on biodiversity, wherever you go. And the end result is that people are not better off in the health perspective. We're all eating more and more calories, but less and less nutrition. We've got a global epidemic of obesity, a lot of other negatives, but we've also got an unsustainable food system. So we're now got to the point where there is no relationship between the price of production of food and its impact on the environment, the cost of production, or its impact on health systems.
Fantastic. I think so. You're more like a farmer. You speak like a farmer from the heart. So my next question is, would you agree that agriculture subsidies in the developed world incentivize large-scale industrial food production, which has become the largest driver of biodiversity loss, in addition to which farmers in developing countries do not receive the true cost of producing healthy and sustainable food? Do you agree, or what would you have to say about the World Trade Organization agriculture subsidies? Do you think they need revising?
Well, that's a very big question. And yes, in short, I think subsidies are one policy instrument that have been put in place, but there are many others. But let's focus on subsidies. At the moment, subsidies are focused typically on a global basis at supporting the production of fewer and fewer crops grown at bigger and bigger scales, more and more and more intensively. And in a sense, because we're focusing the subsidies in the wrong direction, it is driving the negative vicious circles of the cheaper food paradigm that I talked about earlier. Some recent modelling has indicated that were we, for example, to say, well, clearly eating more fruit and vegetables is typically a healthier diet to adopt than eating lots of grain and livestock products. Were we to put our subsidies from grains onto fruit and vegetables, the availability of nutritious diets would go up, the price would come down, the availability of grain might not be particularly affected, the price might change a little bit, the availability of meat might become more pricey because the cost of grain might stop people intensively farming livestock. So just by changing the subsidy structure, that would create a different sort of balance in the way that we incentivize the production of food. So that, in a sense, answers your first question. The second part of your question about the developed versus the lower income and middle income countries, I think is exactly true. We've said, the rich countries have said, you've got to play our game. You've got to open your markets to us to compete with us. Otherwise, we will not give you any finance. And part of your way of opening markets to us is making sure that you join WTO and you play by our rules. So in a sense, these are kind of rich nations' rules that are being foisted on poorer nations with some of the negative consequences that comes from that.
Thank you so much. So we have a new chief at the WTO. Hopefully things will change. Your report also highlights that global dietary patterns need to converge around more plant-based diets, owing to the impact of large-scale animal farming on biodiversity, land use, and environment. Do you think this whole focus of alternate proteins is enough, or do we need to do something to force stop industrial animal production, which is happening at scale? Do we have the time to make a transition over the next years, or do we need to force stop it now?
Well, I have endless optimism that we as a species can do the right thing, and sometimes that gets pushed. But ultimately, I hope that by providing the evidence, we can make the right sorts of decisions. Livestock, of course, drive a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from agriculture, and they drive the bulk of agricultural taking land into agriculture, particularly from the tropical forest regions, and that's primarily around producing soy for livestock feed, and a little bit around producing cheap palm oil from Asia. But were we to, for example, think that we needed to have really deal with climate change, and were we to think about a border carbon tax or a carbon market that was mandated, it would make a very, very big difference to the economic incentives that go into the food system. And my own personal view is that from a global perspective, as you mentioned, poor diets leading to malnourishment in all its forms are the biggest global factor that drives ill health and mortality, even in this year of COVID, and the health crisis we have to deal with. And the easiest way of dealing with the health crisis is not by inventing more and more and more drugs and paying lots of money for them. It is about eating healthily. So I think were governments around the world to really start pushing people to eat healthy diets and not ultra-processed calories and poor nutrition, were governments really to start pushing for healthy diets, they would find ways, whether it's changing subsidies, whether it's changing the research environment and what do we invest money in, whether it's in changing in the rules of trade, whether it is introducing carbon pricing, whether it is incentivizing and putting subsidies onto better, healthier food to take it away from worse. There are many things that governments can do, and I think there is scope for a relatively rapid change in global dietary preferences if we make the right decisions. If we make the wrong decisions and we carry on in the direction of travel we're going, not only will farmers be affected on a global basis by climate change, but everyone will. will be affected by climate change, and the healthcare costs associated with poor diets, including the comorbidities that drive mortality from COVID, will just grow and grow and grow, and we will just hit crisis after crisis in the decades to come.
Thank you for that. What I find worrisome in this year of the pandemic is that we have seen greater consolidation of power and money in big agriculture, big food, big retail, that the agriculture input companies, aggregators, packaged food companies, and e-commerce or retailers, they have gained tremendous power on the majority of organized food consumption, supply, and production. Now, should we be worried about this? Why is it not part of deliberations on food systems that are happening at so many different places? Because this plays out on environment, this plays out on climate change, this plays out on consumption. What would you recommend, and why do you think nobody is targeting this consolidation, which I, as a farmer in India, in the global south, feel threatened with?
I'm not surprised that you feel threatened with. I think we live in an era where economic power, driven through multinational corporations and through governments saying that economic growth above all else is the most important thing to strive for. Economic power is really difficult to imagine an alternative that does not involve consolidation. So whilst we think from a government perspective about GDP growth above everything else, and whilst we think that getting richer on a global basis is the most important thing, that will lead to the most efficient way of making wealth is to have big capital, big industry, and so on. And you are exactly right. Profoundly, whilst it can give economies of scale, it can open up new supply chains, allowing local benefits. It does lead to a huge imbalance in power, and that imbalance in power is really unhelpful in the sense of, you have very little agency as an individual or an individual farmer or an individual consumer. And so how do we break it up? Well, either we rely on governments to say, enough power, this is enough power, let's break up big industry. And certainly you can see increasing unease in governments around the world about the power of the big tech companies, for example. Or we as consumers and we as citizens, or we as a collective of farmers, we try and drive an alternative variety of the food system, either to break up power or to reinvent more local networks of supply and demand and so on. And you can see during the COVID era, there has been huge consolidation, but certainly in the UK where I live, there has also been a flowering of local, more informal food networks and local farmers markets and direct deliveries and so on. So on the one hand, the big companies have got bigger, but also there is a increasing a counter to that, where the small companies are coming together to create a farmer network. But ultimately, we as people, citizens, consumers, farmers, whoever it might be, we have power to make this an issue for the ballot box and to bring our power as a collective of individuals to make economic political inroads into the situation, to break up some of these power relationships. Because ultimately, if you go too far along the line, you will have global government run by a single, very large multinational corporation that does not have the interests of citizens at heart. And government really should be in the situation where it protects us as individuals over and above the need to have to support global economic growth.
So, Tim, I'll come to the last question. Your report states that there are a series of international summits and conferences taking place this year, providing a unique opportunity to evolve the food systems positively. So my question is, do you, as we farmers notice this, do you notice that perhaps there's intentional exclusion and or unconscious bias resulting in absence of adequate representation of farmers and those from the global south in all these high-powered summits and conferences? And if it is so, why do you think it is so?
I don't think it's intentional, but I think the way that governments work is that they are fixated on driving economic growth. And driving economic growth is about intensive, productive industry. And so when people are looking for a voice around the table to represent intensive industrial type processes, they will go to the big agribusinesses, or they will go to the big companies, or they will go to the companies that control the supply chains into the global south. So that is where the economic power that we've just been talking about sits. It is not where do citizens sit, where do small scale producers sit. And I agree, there should be a much stronger voice locally from your community into your government, but from your government representing your community into the wider organizations. We've talked about the WTO, we've talked about the Food System Summit, and so on. There should be that representation, because it's only by getting things right for people will we get things right for the planet as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Really encouraging. And I thank you for sharing your experience and with candor. We hope it helps energize consumers, farmers, and all other stakeholders, industry, NGO, media, governments, to collectively share responsibility. We live in a global world. I believe that together we can achieve a healthy, more sustainable, inclusive, equitable food systems that works for all. Thank you, those who have watched and shared your thoughts on social media. Looking forward to our next Connecting the Dots interview. Eat healthy and stay safe. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.